All right, I think we are ready to go. All right, so I want to welcome everyone to one of our webinars. My name is Mindy Murdoch. I work for Zionsville Parks and Recreation Department. And joining me this evening, I've got a fantastic group of panelists. Claire Lane with Hamilton County Soil and Water Conservation District. Go slow down. Coralie Palmer with the Indiana Native Plant Society, and Dan McCord with Hamilton County Urban Conservation Association. And if you're tuning in, it's because you either live in an HOA or you're part of an HOA board, or maybe you're just wondering what HOAs are up to. But we are going to do just a brief, I guess, 10,000 feet, maybe a little lower, of restoring native landscapes within your HOA. So we're going to touch on some very different areas. At the end of there, we will have some facilitating questions to kind of hopefully get that conversation started in your own HOA. And if you had registered for this, you will be receiving a PDF of the presentation, as well as a list of resources. If you're tuning into this through YouTube, at the end, there will be a QR code. If you scan that with your phone, it will bring up that PDF of resources for your use. So, but we are going to get started. So I will hopefully start the show here. So there we go. So this kind of webinar fits in with a series of webinars that we've been doing since the beginning of the year. And it really has to tie in with our climate action plan that we have here in Zionsville. So our climate action plan for Zionsville is a roadmap for the town of Zionsville, really to show the changes that we could do to increase our sustainability efforts, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, lessen the impact we have with our environment. So this, native plants falls under our strategy 4.2, which is provide sustainability and climate education to residents. And it's really been kind of the strategy that we've been hitting a lot here with Zionsville Parks and Recreation. So if you are interested in more, you can go ahead and go onto the Town of Zionsville's website, and our climate action plan is available out there for everyone to read. So I will start the introduction of really why pursue restoring native habitats within your HOA. Well, the first thing to think about is you're probably tuning in because perhaps you already have some goals that you're looking to accomplish within your HOA. It could be as simple as you just want to beautify your current HOA landscape to maintain your property values, or maybe even increase your property values. Perhaps you're trying to find ways to educate your community and provide maybe even some more recreational opportunities that are there. Of course, tied in with parks, the ecosystem development, so utilizing native species. Maybe like a lot of you've been doing some work in your HOA and you've seen those maintenance fees continue to increase. So you're wondering about that. Or looking at ways to lessen the use of chemicals for turf management. Again, that usually ties in with fees to go with that one. Maybe you're looking at updating your covenants, or you've got some issues with stormwater or deer or geese or invasive species. So kind of what are your goals? And it also ties into really what are some of those problems maybe you're trying to resolve that native landscaping may help. It could be flooding or erosion. It might be those invasive species that developers have installed over the years. Maybe there's areas that aren't the best for mowing. It might be a little dangerous, or just the grass isn't thriving there. Perhaps you're looking at ways to add shade or reduce noise or add more privacy. Maybe you've got those common areas that just aren't really utilized. You don't really see people in your community using them. So maybe this is an opportunity to do something new and exciting. Looking at updating your landscape, or again, maybe it's just coming down to the cost and the maintenance that is coming with some of this landscaping you currently have. So what are really the benefits of natural landscapes? There's lots of benefits out there, but a few that I wanted to touch on that are kind of like the high-end ones that we want to think about with natural landscaping is, one, it's the air quality improvement. If you're going to reduce your turf areas with natural landscaping, that means that you're reducing the amount of emissions that you're going to be putting out there with mowing. Another reduction that you're going to look at is native plants are adapted to this area. So they are used to the local pests. They can handle the nutrients. They can handle the soil that we have here in Indiana. They're used to that rainfall, so they need less maintenance. So that means less watering, less pesticides, less fertilizer, or really no pesticides or fertilizers a lot of times. They can help with stormwater management. So planted areas, unlike turf and pavement, turf's not much better than actual asphalt or cement. Those natural planted areas can help slow down stormwater runoff or help relieve some erosion or some flooding issues. They provide food and shelter for wildlife because that's what wildlife has adapted with. And then they can do an aesthetic improvement. And we'll actually touch on that tonight, as well as a lot of these other ones, is that really natural landscaping with native plants, it really fits all those architectural requirements that people think about in formal landscaping. So just because it's a natural native plant doesn't mean you can't have that ornamental or that formal landscape that your HOA may want to have. So I'm going to turn this one over to Coralie now.
Thanks ever so much, Mindy. So one of the key factors for successfully restoring native landscapes is buy-in and engagement from the community. So I'm just going to give a really brief overview of some concepts and ideas that might help with this. So perhaps one of the most important factors is species selection. So choosing the right plants for the right place. Species selection will influence the aesthetics, the maintenance, and the ecological value of your habitat. We have hundreds of wonderful native plant species here in Indiana, and choosing the ones to best suit your conditions and spaces will really help you to make your habitats both ecologically valuable and enjoyable for your neighborhood. So some of the main considerations are the size and function of the space, the level of maintenance you're able to provide, and the site conditions. Native plant communities support a great deal more biodiversity than introduced plants, and the native species that you choose really can make a very big difference to the value of your habitat. Research indicates that a few plant genera are really critical for local ecosystems, going above and beyond in terms of productivity. So planting those keystone natives will have a disproportionately large impact on restoring biodiversity and help to create the most productive landscapes possible. This not only provides wonderful habitat, but can be incredibly rewarding in terms of wildlife viewing opportunities in your neighborhood. Other key concepts to consider are planting for specialist insects and ensuring that you're planting so you have successional blooming period for as long a season as you possibly can, from early spring through fall. And we're really lucky here in Zionsville and Condo to be in the foraging zone for some of the few remaining populations of rusty patch bumblebees. So considering plants that will support these populations, particularly early in the spring, is really important. And also we often focus on herbaceous plants. And I know both Claire and Dan have some excellent information on larger scale plantings with herbaceous perennials, but it's also just worth mentioning the options for native woody plants. So adding native trees and shrubs to your HOA areas can be a wonderful way to greatly increase the ecological value of your habitat while keeping maintenance time and costs very low. In research published in 2020, 10 woody plant genera were identified as outliers due to their disproportionately high value to butterflies and moths. And this research found that a native oak tree is the most powerful. So when using herbaceous plants, if possible, echoing native plant communities is an excellent approach. And we have great resources on the INPS website to help with this. For other areas of your neighborhood landscaping, such as by entrance beds, ecological value can still be a big consideration, but aesthetics may also be high on the list of priorities. The wonderful thing about landscaping with native plants is that they can fulfill both roles. You can have any design or aesthetic. We have our wonderful tallgrass prairie plants that look majestic in larger spaces, but we also have many native plant species that are smaller in structure and may be better suited to more formal landscaping areas. The resources on the INPS website will hopefully be able to help you match native species with your landscaping goals. And we're also very excited that a collaboration between the Indiana Native Plant Society and the Indiana Wildlife Federation has produced an excellent local plant finder tool that combines both ecological data with landscaping information. And that link is on the list of resources from Mindy. So once you've decided on your species, you can also use various design and management tools to help encourage buy-in from your community. Design tools and management can help to give a more formal or cared for look for your areas of landscaping. For example, using distinct edges for your fence or fencing, mowed paths through natural areas, placing seats or garden sculpture, using larger groups of one species for impact and structure, repeating patterns, color, or combinations of plants, and the use of plant labels and signs. You can also create small pocket prairies and demonstration areas. Management techniques such as cutting back taller perennials like goldenrod and monarda in early summer can give a shorter stature, and then cutting again some of the earlier blooming species back after flowering to promote fresh growth can also really help. Again, we have some great resources on these topics on the INPS website. And there's an excellent presentation on the INPS YouTube channel entitled Beauty and the Beasties, Landscaping 101 for a Wildlife-Friendly Garden by Sarah Gray, which really goes into detail on some of the landscape design principles. So next slide, please, Mindy. And so education is also key. Helping the community to understand why restoring native habitat is so important is vital to getting buy-in. We found that newsletter and neighborhood social media content can be really helpful, and we'll be putting sample content that you can use up on the INPS website. Educating residents on plant-insect interactions, insect life cycles, options to reduce chemical use, and alternatives to pesticides is also really critical. So signage in restoration areas can be very effective for promoting buy-in and helping people to understand what you're doing. Some options include certifying your landscape with INPS or the Indiana Wildlife Federation and getting signage through these programs. You can also register your native plantings as part of the Homegrown National Park scheme, and you can download signage from their website. And other organizations such as the Xerxes Society also have excellent signs that you can purchase. So changing attitudes and starting the conversation about who our landscapes are for will also be a big part to buy-in. We really need a shift in our thinking so that as a society, we see land not just for people, where the primary focus is often on aesthetics or fashion, but we consider landscapes more in terms of ecosystem function. Hopefully our landscapes can be beautiful, functioning, living ecosystems that contribute to the well-being of all the life that shares them. And then finally, sorry, next slide, please, Mindy. And then finally, for getting really good buy-in, engaging the community is critical. Ideas that can really help are plant and seed giveaways. So one of the great things about native plants is that they do multiply. In my own neighborhood, we're going to be able to do that this fall with milkweed starts from our neighborhood plantings. You can use little free libraries with packets of collected seed or information on the plantings. You can give wildlife and pollinator watches and tours in your neighborhood, providing volunteer hours for maintenance opportunities. The habitat certification programs, such as through the IWF, are wonderful for doing with children in the community. And then invasive weed wrangles are a way for everybody to really get involved. So hopefully that just gives a really brief overview. And I'm going to pass on to Claire for some of the more practical details.
Oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to take us really quickly through some of the practicalities of how you would get started. So the first thing you'd be looking at would be to evaluate the property that you have for your common areas and try to target areas that are currently underutilized. Whether that's, they're costing you money to maintain, they're having resource issues like erosion, or just not being actively used by the community in the capacity that they are now. So I would also encourage everyone to get help when you can. There are a lot of different organizations that cover assistance in different areas, and we're going to give you some resources on different groups to connect with at the end. But they should be able to help you plan, prioritize, and bring resources together to make your project happen. Next, you would create a plan and a timeline to initiate that plan. But as it's been mentioned before, Presenting or selling your plan to an HOA board or the community itself is a really big deal. Buy-in is critical and really worth taking time to do properly and to do well for the overall success of your project. So things like neighborhood workshops, giving presentations or giving your community members access to information from experts, online posts, next door, social media, things like that, newsletter, articles and things like that are really helpful. Of course, budget is really important, whether you might have to plan a few years out or get started a little quicker, but including maintenance, if possible, in your budget is a really smart decision. And then finally, you'd be ready to go. And I always encourage people to start small if they can. So it's a good way to make sure that you can manage the project and it's not, biting off more than you can chew. And it's also a good opportunity when you start small to do a small portion and have it go well. And that can help you sell advancing the idea to the rest of your community to expand it into other areas. So just some really basics of site prep. It really is going to depend on the different conditions and existing vegetation around your property. For most HOAs, it's going to be turf grass, converting away from turf grass. So typically eliminating that vegetation is going to be with an herbicide. I know, particularly if you're focused on pollinator habitat, you think, oh no, herbicide, I don't want to use any chemicals or anything like that. But for large scale projects, it's really the only practical way to prep your site and get an effective site prep. And the good thing about it, and the way I think about it and explain it to people, is that a little bit or one or two applications of a judiciously applied by the label appropriate herbicide to replace turf grass that is requiring so many inputs constantly, week after week, year after year. So a little bit of a chemical application to transition that to something that's going to require less inputs and give back so much more to the environment is probably totally worth it. There are some other options depending on the size of your project, things like tillage, smothering, or using a sod cutter for smaller landscape style plantings as well. The timeline you're going to install on, there's a lot of different effective timelines to work on, but I can't stress enough that really effective site prep and eliminated invasive species and noxious weeds is so worth it. I know whenever you finally get buy-in and get things moving and you have the budget and you're ready to roll, it can be really easy to want to jump ahead and okay, let's rush through prep so that we can get to the fun part of planting and starting to see things come up. But in the long run, that effective site prep is going to be critical to the overall success or failure of your planting. So most of you would either plant via seeds or with plugs. So as far as seeds go, typically a timeline that makes a lot of sense is spring and summer prep, and then you would seed in the fall or over the winter. So that gives you, most of the good part of the year to get things prepped. But sometimes depending on what kind of weed pressure you have or something for your site, you could be looking at site prep that might take, 2 or even 3 years. So it really depends. But for these native seeds, frost seeding works really well because the freeze and thaw throughout the winter helps work that seed right down into the ground. And then we're not getting into this kind of level of projects today, but it also undergoes natural cold stratification, which helps those native seeds, a lot of them germinate and come up in the spring. So a fall and a winter seeding would favor forbs and sedges, so flowering plants that you think of, things like that in a prairie, versus seeding in the spring is going to generally favor your native grasses. So one is not right and one is wrong. It just depends on the site and your timeline. Either way can be incredibly effective. Generally, the seeding window is anywhere from October to late May. Those really warm summer months is not an appropriate time to be trying to do projects from seed. It's possible, but not the best. So the benefits of using seed, definitely lower cost, but the negatives would be that it takes longer to develop. These native plantings, they're a commitment, especially to get established, because they have to do a lot of work growing down and establishing dense root systems before they grow up and do a lot of that flowering and producing color and the plants, the seeds that pollinators are going to want. So with this, a planting from seed, it always, depends. Some are faster than others, but generally you're looking at 2 to 3 growing seasons before you're seeing a lot of like the really pretty prairie type species. So your seeding method of how you actually get the seed into the ground, again, depends on how your site was prepped, the size of your planting, what your budget is, the logistics as far as access and things like that. So a common way would be an herbicide application to eliminate the turf, and then using what's called a no-till drill. This is a piece of planting machinery that's specifically set up for native seed. So that's a picture of the equipment you have on your screen now. It has different bins on top that are appropriate for the various different sizes of native seeds. Some are teeny tiny, some are large and fluffy. So they go in different bins, and then the machine is calibrated so that it can plant effectively, and it just drops, like opens a little slit in the ground and then drops the seed in and covers it back up. So that's a really great way. Smaller projects, you might be able to get by with even hand seeding or broadcast seeding. Sometimes a cone seeder can be appropriate. A natural resource professional or a knowledgeable contractor would be able to help you decide what was best for your site. If you're doing a plug planting, so we're talking, when I say plugs, I mean like little baby plants, little first year natives. Spring or fall can be great for those too. You're just going to want to avoid the, drought and heat of summer. You could plant in the summer, but it's going to take a lot of supplemental watering. The benefits there would be that you get a lot of instant gratification. Things can look pretty a lot faster. They can be good for sites that have maybe moving water or are susceptible to flooding, because they can provide some erosion control. Negatives would definitely be that they're more expensive for sure. So it depends on your budget, the size of your project, a lot of different factors. Using plugs or even larger quarter-gallon size native plants can be really great for smaller plantings, but also areas that are higher profile. So maybe at the entranceway of your community, or a high profile like park-like setting, landscape bed outside of the common area, or the pool, or your meeting house or something like that. So there are good options. If you're doing a larger area and have the budget to use plugs, you'd want to make sure that you purchase plants in flats or wholesale, and there's multiple vendors you can do that from. That would really bring the cost down, generally looking at about $1.50 to $3 per plug. Maintenance is absolutely critical, particularly within those first few years. A lot of people get the idea that native plantings are no maintenance or super low maintenance, but they do still take care, and it takes some knowledge to be able to manage these projects effectively. Particularly in those first few years, you're going to be battling a lot of annual weeds. So we typically address those through sequences of mowing the whole prairie down, because really what's growing most that first year is those annual weeds. So you mow them to keep them down about once a month, and that gives time for those tiny baby natives to work on their root system and get established. You really want to keep an eye out for invasive species and noxious weeds, things like Canada thistle and stuff like that those first few years. Smaller projects, you can probably get by with just having a nice mulch layer and then hand weeding, or using a targeted herbicide application just on what you're trying to take out. In the larger plantings, mowing and definitely targeted herbicides as well, to take out the worst species. Over time, maintenance should decrease as things really establish and start to fill in. And ongoing, particularly for a larger scale planting, you'd be looking at targeted applications of herbicides, Mowing probably at least annually. Sometimes you can stretch that out a bit. And for some properties, even HOA common areas, right in the middle of a bunch of homes, you can actually get away with burning, which is a natural prairie management tool. So there are a lot of options that you can evaluate. I always recommend for people, if you can, when I'm working with HOAs, to do everything you can to try to budget for at least those first few years of maintenance with a restoration company. These plantings are specialized enough that it's kind of outside the realm of the typical landscaper that your HOA might use. So these restoration companies that would be maybe something you'd be contracting to actually do the installation of these projects, you could contract with them to do maintenance. And it's great because they are coming in, they know exactly what they're looking for. They know how to adaptively manage your project based on what they're seeing there. So it's really effective and helps things get established really well. So at least do that if you can the first few years to get yourself started off really well. So patience, like I said, it can take often 3 years to get really, full hardy establishment. So it's really important in a community setting to make sure that your neighbors and community have realistic expectations of what that timeline is and what it's going to look like at different stages along the way. And there are a lot of resources that can help you convey that. Some common causes of failure would be planting too deep. Those native seeds really just need to get contact with the ground so they can get buried too deep and then they never germinate. Improper planting methods, hydroseeding doesn't really work with natives, for example, not sourcing high quality seed, failure to maintain, of course. And then a lot of times there's just a perceived failure due to either slow germination or people just not understanding the timeline that these plantings are functioning on. So they perceive that it's a complete failure. And like mentioned earlier, getting buy-in, things like determining your maintenance costs per acre of your existing turf management per se, or projected costs in the future of what you're going to have to do to remediate erosion issues on a pond, things like that. There's a lot of figures out there about how trees, like Coralie mentioned, it's not just these 4 prairie plantings. If you're doing trees and shrubs, there's a lot of research on the impact of property values as well. So those are things that you can see, you can use to sell these practices to your community, particularly the people who aren't as concerned about all the environmental great benefits can be swayed by the dollars and cents that these projects really pay off. So effectively communicating that long-term savings potential is really important. So just a little example here, April year 1, you can see they came in here a month later and they had killed their turf. And then on the next slide, you see the August of just the first year, and then just the next year of June, kind of seeing how prairies develop. So helping people understand by giving them visuals, directing them to other sites and things like that can be really helpful. We have a map, and I built a resources page on our website that Mindy's going to share with you. Like, we have a map of where you can direct people to go look at different type of projects. And I've also assembled a big listing of all of the different resources that might be available for you. For example, the Soil and Water Conservation District in Hamilton County has different offerings than Boone County or Hendricks County might have, but there are a lot of resources that cross those boundaries. So I've compiled a really nice list there for you, as well as a list of resource professionals, funding mechanisms, a contractor list. It's not exhaustive by any means, but it's a good place to start. So definitely check out all those resources that Mindy is going to share, and I look forward to answering questions later.
Thank you, Claire. I guess it's my turn. My name is Dan McCord, and as you can see, that's was my subdivision in Fishers, Indiana, which was the Ridgefield subdivision. 16 years ago, I sat in your chair of wondering what to do. So if this was the end product. If we click to the next slide, you're going to probably see this is what probably most of you have in your subdivision. And it was what we had in 2005. You know, the typical subdivision of large mowed common areas, retention ponds that were pretty poor quality of, you know, the algae erosion, geese and the like. So we had about 10 acres of common area. We're a fairly small subdivision. So like probably a lot of you, the developer turned the subdivision HOA over to the homeowners, and we were faced with quite a dilemma. We had you know, those large areas that were being mowed and maintained, but we didn't have dues set at a level to be able to pay for everything. So the one of the first things we had to do was figure out, how do we address our financial imbalance? We were going to spend a lot more than we were bringing in. I was president of the Homeowners Association and had to kind of really dig in to figure out, you know, what can we do? You know, we were looking at either doubling dues, which obviously no one in the subdivision or the HOA wanted, or we had to cut costs. And when you looked at our expenses, common area maintenance was our number one, our biggest expense. So as I was going through alternatives of, well, what do we do? Do we just not mow and just let it go? Is there something else we can do? And I remember seeing an illustration similar to the one here on the screen. It's actually one of my favorite illustrations. If you look on the far left-hand side, you see Kentucky bluegrass, but you can insert any cool season non-native grass in that area, and you can see the root depth is very shallow, which we all know. That's why our grass turns brown and dries up in July and August because it doesn't have a root base. But if you can compare everything to the right, would be a native plant, and you can just see how deep and extensive the root system is. And we had to get away from the mindset of we like the mowed golf course look of non-native lawn grass, and that's what it is. Our ancestors brought grass that was geared for a cool season, rainy environment, and we plopped them down in the middle of Indiana that has scorching summers, heavy clay soil, and sometimes little rain. So we wonder why we spend so much money watering and fertilizing and maintaining. So when I ran across this illustration, it struck me, why can't we turn our common area into something that was meant to be here in its place? So if you look at our alternatives of a native plant with deep root systems, doesn't require fertilizer, does not require, you know, watering. So it offered a low maintenance, and I want to stress that, low maintenance, not no maintenance alternative. So if you look at the next slide, I'm kind of an accountant by trade, so I like empirical data. So I wanted to, as I was doing this, sit down and figure out how much we could really save over a period of time. And what I did was just gathered and maintain a log of what we were spending beforehand versus what we were spending once we actually did the conversion. And you can see of our 6 areas that we took out of basically and made a nature park, you had, you know, the retention pond and some other, so we have some tree areas and some shrub areas that we put in, but in essence, we took 4 acres of grass out of the weekly maintenance of mowing and the like. So, you know, back in 2005, when we were looking at this, we were spending about $6,200 a year to maintain those 4 acres. So what I did then was look to see what the actual costs I kept track of. And you can see for a 12-year period, because I moved in 2000 at the end of 2017. But what I did was tracked what we actually spent on maintenance, and then as we went in a little further on, so you can start seeing in 2010, 2011, we started spending more money. That's because we started introducing more species to the planting. You know, Claire had mentioned site prep, and then I think, you know, Carol talked about species selection. We actually chose a mix for the greatest part of it that was actually had a herbicide that could be applied after the fact, and that was a plateau herbicide, which subsequently got taken off the shelf, but I think it's been relabeled under Panoramic or another name now. But there are actually forbs or wildflowers, and then most of our native grasses was tolerant for that herbicide. So we were able to utilize kind of a herbicide application for our weed control early on in the process. But by doing that, that limited the diversity and the amount of species that we were able to offer, because that herbicide, you know, has maybe 20 or 30 species of forb or wildflower that can tolerate application. So what we did was made a conscious decision to utilize that as one of our tools or quivers or bows in our quiver to battle weeds on the early stages, knowing that we would spend a little bit more money down the road to invest and introduce different species. And then we also started addressing the erosion on our ponds. So you'll start seeing some of those years where we did shoreline installations to help stabilize shorelines and things like that. But as you can see, even our most expensive year was like 2016. We spent about $2,000 for maintenance and upkeep for that was our expense. Compare that to the $6,200 we would have spent to begin with, and obviously we still netted, came out on the positive nearly $4,300 that year. So over the 12 years that I was there and kept track of what we actually spent, our little subdivision of 150 homes saved $63,000 in maintenance expenses. So our motivation was, like I said, started out to be totally financial. It was, how can we save money? How can we not raise our dues? But the benefits that went beyond financial were just astounding. And in my opinion, even though we saved $63,000, those other benefits were just as great, if not greater. So you can see here was the retention pond that sat in that area that we took out of the grass and put into the native plantings. You can see that's actually a pickerel weed, which is a shoreline plant, a shallow water plant, and I can actually see probably some other species growing in there. But we did that shoreline planting, and as you can see on the back side of the picture, our bank was taken out of the turf grass and put into native grasses. And if you go back to thinking of that illustration that I had, the little, or the bluegrass or the lawn turf grass that had very shallow root systems versus our native plants that have deep root system, kind of the analogy is if you take a Dixie cup and you take a 5-gallon bucket and you sit them side by side and you start dumping fertilizers and chemicals, which one fills up quicker? Well, obviously the Dixie cup fills up fast and overruns, and that's what our lawn grass does. Our lawn grass, one, basically absorbs nothing, provides basically no benefit, and not only that, but we're providing the poison all the way down to the shoreline because we have to fertilize and put chemicals on our turf grass. Well, when we take that away and you put that 50-gallon drum or 5-gallon bucket in its place, you absorb so much more water, stormwater runoff and pollution. We actually have, which once again, I like empirical data. We have 2 ponds in our neighborhood. So this one that was within the restored area. And then there was another one, virtually identical, a little bit larger, but had the same issues, that was 2 blocks away, that was not part of the restoration. So I'd say six years into it, give or take, Claire and the Soil and Water Conservation District came out and we did testing. So we tested our 2 ponds, the one that we did the restoration on and the one that didn't. And the differences you can see on the screen there, the nitrogen and nitrates were nearly 60% lower in the pond that had the natural filtration around it. Phosphates were 17% lower. Dissolved oxygen, or another sign of water quality, was almost 50% higher. And being a fisherman, I can attest to you that if you like fishing and you like fish, you want higher oxygen level. The fishing was so much better in this pond compared to the other pond. And then that last measurement is just the water clarity or turbidity. They basically put a disc down in the water and see how deep they can put it and still see it. That the water clarity was almost 60% better in the pond where we had this restoration or the natural plants surrounding. And we get back to, because they can absorb all of those chemicals and those stormwater runoff before they enter the water in our retention pond. So here's another view from that same pond. You can see some cardinal flower blooming, lots of sedges growing along the edge, a nice little native pond weed growing along the edge. One thing that you see noticeably absent from that picture is algae. Algae love chemicals and fertilizers. So if you have a retention pond and you have it treated and you have a rain event the next week, you have an immediate algae bloom. So it's a nonstop cycle of basically spraying and killing your algae and then having the algae rebloom and spraying and killing again, and that degrades the quality of the pond. So if you go back and think about some of those metrics that I had on the prior screen of, nitrogen levels, clarity, dissolved oxygen, all related to the lack of algae on this pond. So in fact, we made the observation, there is no algae on this pond. Why are we paying a company to come and spray this pond? Or I don't think they were spraying, but at least being charged for it when they were coming out and doing a monthly spray on the other pond. So we actually redid our contract and removed this pond on an as needed, as I directed basis. And over the final 6 years, we did not have it treated one time. And you can see in that picture, there is no algae. So think about then what's not captured on that $62,000 we saved. We were saving $500 a year, give or take, on not having the pond treated. One of the other things you probably saw absent from that picture, which you see here from the other pond, are geese. There is a nice paved walking trail along the bank of that pond that you saw in that photo. You could not use it. It was nothing. There was always geese, what the geese leave behind. And it was just, was not enticing or encouraging people to utilize. So people did not really utilize it because it was just a goose poop factory, and then having to deal with, honking and geese chasing you. Once we did the restoration, there was not one goose that ever visited that pond, or if they did, they landed or circled and saw, we don't like this pond, let's go visit one of the other 10,000 ponds in the area that we like, that has non-native lawn turf grass all the way down to the edge. And why is that? Well, geese, just from instinctually, do not like taller grass. So when we mow our grass at 3 inches all the way around the pond, we're providing them with wonderful egress and ingress, and they have a great sight view to see, is there a predator sitting along the bank that might want to eat me? But if we go and you put some 3 foot tall little blue stem or sedges or some of the other forbs around the pond, and it doesn't even need to be to the extent that we did it, where we did the entire area. It works with even a small buffer, that if they cannot see what's on the bank, they will not go out, and therefore they tend to fly somewhere else where they can find that option. The other thing is, obviously, they like to eat the turf grass. They don't necessarily like the taller grass to eat. So by doing the restoration, one of the other side benefits was we totally eliminated the geese from around that pond. But on the other hand, what we did do was we provided an environment or a habitat. And if you go back to that very first slide, our motto for our organization is think habitat, not grass. When we provided habitat, be it the native grasses, native forbs, native trees, native shrubs, we had a tremendous explosion in wildlife. So on the screen there are photos that were all taken either from my backyard, which was just very, very close to, or from the actual restored common area. The far left-hand side is the yellow bumblebee, or Bombus furvitus, and it is actually experiencing catastrophic decline in numbers, and the projections it's going to be face extinction in 50 to 75 years. And we had them in great numbers in our planting and in my yard. What you see there in the middle is the white M-hair streak, a little non-discrete butterfly, but it's actually on the Indiana State Rare, Endangered, and Threatened Species list, and yet we had it in our neighborhood. And then obviously we all love songbirds, and there's one that's not critically endangered, the American goldfinch. But if you put in habitat that draws pollinators, which are insects or food sources, or seeds, you get a tremendous amount of bird activity. It was never unusual to have flocks of up to 50 goldfinches flying around. There were constantly hummingbirds visiting the monarda or the cardinal flower. Just unbelievable amount of wildlife. So once again, financial was the reason we did this, but these other benefits were just extraordinary. So once again, in the middle or edge of Fishers, we had endangered and threatened species in numbers that we saw that you probably would be lucky for some people to see in a lifetime. And I know these screens are kind of repeat for what Claire showed, and it was back before, if you remember, 2005, 2006, before the advent of nice little cameras on your phones that took high quality photos. But what you see there was our subdivision, the common area. And as Cher indicated, we did a herbicide application to begin with. And so we used something that would kill the turf grass. And once again, I stress site preparation is paramount. And once again, if you go back to the screen where we had endangered and threatened species in our habitat, the end result and the benefits far outweigh any of the potential short-term negatives of a herbicide application. So I think I saw one of the questions popped up. Were we concerned about herbicide application? Well, obviously we wanted to utilize the herbicide to the label application instructions and utilize it to the least amount that we could. But no, we were not worried about the use of herbicide. And we saw, as you can see, the end result was a tremendous amount of wildlife. So it actually, the benefit of providing habitat far outweighs any of the negatives that you can put in place from a herbicide. So that first year, I think she actually switched ahead on me because I'm talking. There we go. That left or the right hand side is actually what Claire talked about in that first year, our native grasses and our native forbs are thinking back about root growth. So if you think about that illustration that had root systems that are 6, 8, 10 feet deep, they're focusing on developing roots that first year. So this is what our midsummer first year looked like. A lot of people would consider that a failure, but it's actually not. We actually have a few scattered annuals and biennials, probably lance leaf coreopsis or black-eyed Susan blooming in there. But that is actually a very good site to see on a first year planting, where you see ground and the lack of weeds after we were able to control it. Now you can flip through to year 2. So year 1, once again, we had very little bloom. We did use some annual flowers. I think in Cher's illustration probably had the purple, I can't remember, cosmos, that's what it is, purple cosmos. We actually used a sulfur cosmos that bloomed first year, but then the first mow, it was gone. Year 2, you can start to see those biennials, like the left-hand side, the black-eyed Susans, really start coming on. And by the end of the year, the New England asters and the goldenrods, and I say goldenrod, goldenrod is actually a desirable species. It is very critical and important, those two species you see there, asters and goldenrods, for the monarch migration. So we all know about planting milkweed for the larval host, but those pollinator and nectar sources are critically important for their fall migration. So that scene you saw there was just covered in monarch butterflies that were juicing up, ready for their trip back to Mexico. And then if you switch to year 3, Claire talked about where it really takes 3 years to fully develop. And here you can see more of the black-eyed Susan on the left-hand side that was early in the year, but then by the later in the year, they're falling off, and you can see, the gray-headed coneflower, Monarda, some of those other purple coneflowers, some of those other species really coming in. And if you look close, it's harder to see, but there's a lot of little blue stem grass that's growing in there also. So this was our common area 3 years afterwards that we got to look at. So I know I've talked about a lot. I think I've probably taken more time than I was supposed to. So we'll open it up to questions.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. Yeah, so there's some questions here. Again, the thought might be, if you are watching with your HOA board, or if you're wanting to actually present this to the board as a potential for within your community, just some questions to start facilitating those discussions if they haven't already been discussed during the board, so those goals that they want, the problems that you have, really looking at, how much common area do you have? And, what are those yearly costs for maintenance? Because we know that those maintenance costs are going to continue to increase, especially with the cost of gasoline and for chemical treatments. Do you have buy-in within your community? Are community members asking to actually see and have some of this restoration take place? And then the biggest one also is, again, it's not that no maintenance at all. We're restoring it, but doesn't mean that we can't just leave it as it is and not have to worry about that maintenance. So do you have that within the budget of the HOA to continue to cover some of those restoration costs? So, and I have one more thing here. So like I said, if you registered for this webinar, I will be sending you a PDF of all these resources, so you will have them that you can email them easily. If you are watching this later as a recording or on YouTube, if you use your phone and hit this QR code, it's going to give a full list of everything that Claire talked about. A link for Hamilton County Soil and Water. I know she popped it into the chat as well. A lot of the resources, pretty much all the resources that Coralie had mentioned in her talk, as also I know with Claire's links that can link to Dan's research and Dan's organization also. And then of course, you know how to get a hold of us at the Zionsville Parks. But we'll open it up. If you have a question you want to pop into the chat, I will throw it at the panelists, because again, I'm not a restorationist, I'm a naturalist by trade. But a couple questions that did pop up. One was, and maybe this is for Dan, with your restoration around your ponds to prevent erosion, what time frame did you use between treating with herbicide to actually planting to prevent any sort of erosion from happening?
Yeah, so we actually did the herbicide application in early spring, which then killed the grass. And then we did actually hand broadcast seeding around, because our banks were so steep that we actually did a hand broadcast, and it was about a month later. The thing about using that herbicide by killing the grass, we actually left kind of a mulch, an area that grass that was there died, and kept the soil in place to allow the natives time to root and take off. We actually, like I said, broadcast, and then we took a roller and rolled over to get good seed to soil contact. So our planting was really within a month.
Yeah. Okay. And then another question someone asked is, did you leave along the banks, did you leave an area for fishing, since it increased the fishing opportunities? Or was it like the fishermen had to like fend for themselves as they like traipse through the sedges to get to it?
You had to wear long pants. We did not leave an area. But like I said, our choice of species was generally shorter in stature. So what you saw around the pond, and specifically the pond bank, was little blue stem grass was the primary grass, which is a 3-foot tall grass. And then the sedges, the burr sedges and the porcupine sedges around the shoreline are a shorter stature even than that. So.
Good. All right, I'm gonna pop through here. So sorry if I kind of have a look on my face as I'm trying to see some of these ones. I know someone did ask about the herbicides and the impact that they have on pollinators and other insects. And I think it's important. I know Dan mentioned it, restoration, to do it quality wise, you're going to have to use some treatments. But there is a huge difference between a 1 or 2 application treatment and then putting down natives versus what you're typically doing in an HOA or in people's yards, where it's every 6 weeks, they're coming through with full on fertilizers and herbicide. So that's a constant barrage of pesticides versus that 1 or 2 time so you can get started. And then that, every once in a while, if you would have to do it for maintenance. So it is a huge difference comparing the 2 different ones for it. What else do we got here? Do you guys see something that pops up?
I think I saw something I saw something about community or buy-in, I think I saw. And actually my subdivision is a perfect example of buy-in and community involvement throughout the time. Obviously, I was very involved and we had some other individuals that were very involved. I left in 2017. I think everyone else that was in that group left within 6 to 12 months. So if you go by it today, it does not look anything like what's in those photos. It has reverted back to more of a woody look of cottonwood trees growing in, and obviously the invasives of the honeysuckle and whatnot. So it is very important for that community buy-in, and not only that, but then involvement, because concentration and knowledge in just a small number, we learned the hard way as I drove by the other day and witnessed, they viewed it as no maintenance versus low maintenance after I left and did nothing. So
See another comment on here with regards to unwanted insects and wanting to keep it mowed to prevent those. I think the important thing here to remember is, any area that's going to have natural, there's always that potential to get things such as ticks or such as chiggers. You're not going to probably be putting these in areas that you're going to have people wanting to traipse through them all the time, right? We're talking, again, either an area that's not utilized a lot within your common area that you can restore it back to a natural habitat, or along ponds because you're trying to help with that erosion or that water quality control. So, if it's an area that people are going to be walking through continuously, then maybe make a path for them to use. But the nice thing is, and we've seen this, even within people's backyards, that as you start to restore those ecosystems, what we consider a pest insect, you're going to have other insects that are going to move in and help, control that population for you. So really it's you're trying to build the ecosystem. And then as those other insects, those birds, those other species move in, they're going to do what they do best and making sure that that pest level is under control. A lot of our pest issues are because we've actually made that issue itself with our selection of what we want to have and not have. We're going against what is the natural ecosystem that should be there. So,
and I can speak to that from experience. We oftentimes held events and meetings at our restoration, and in the middle of it, I always say, "Do you notice anything missing?" And people would scratch their head, and I would say mosquitoes, because we rarely had issues with mosquitoes because we drew in all of those beneficial insects, and mosquitoes like stagnant water and not necessarily healthy habitats. So we actually reduce the amount of pesky insects rather than increased.
Someone asked, as far as maybe Clara, you can help on this one. If your pond has riprap around it, is it still a possibility to do plantings?
Yeah. So, you could go to the trouble of trying to remove it all, but it's possible to also plant like behind it or within it as well and still get a lot of the benefits, particularly with like planting serving as a filter, and also the wildlife and erosion control benefits. It can be a little tricky sometimes because the mixing of the plants and the riprap can aesthetically maybe not always be super pleasing. So there's some different options, but it's possible.
And I know Rose asked a question. So at any point do you go through with herbicide and spot spray? And I would say that's kind of the line of where Claire had mentioned, if you're working with a restoration group to install and working out that management plan. I know here within our parks, we have restoration companies that they come in and they'll check some of our restored prairies. And that's what they do, is they will go through, and if they see, especially an invasive plant, they will spot spray treat with herbicide, just that plant itself. So that's one thing. Again, if you're going to be doing this, is make sure you have a good quality management plan that your HOA sticks to, and whether that's you do it in-house or you actually work with a contractor that knows what they're doing, just to keep, if it's a prairie, to keep those woodies out of there, to really watch for those invasives, because we know, you're going to get a lot of pear trees and you're going to get a lot of honeysuckle if all you do is plant it and walk away. So it does need some management to it. And I think we'll see if is there one or two more? Someone asked for permission. I would always just check with your planning department for whatever city or town you live in, and check that one out just to make sure before you start any project. So another one would be if you have county drains or things of that sort, and you're planning around drainage, is to check with your drainage to make sure that there is no issues with doing any restoration. Usually they'll benefit, they'll be happy for it because it actually can kind of help sometimes with the drainage concerns. So. All right. Do you guys see anything? Okay, here's one more for you, Dan, since you're not there anymore. So what would it take to reclaim the planting that you originally put in? It would be something that the current homeowners association could do, or would they have to start from a beginning? What's your thoughts?
They could definitely reclaim. It would basically go back to one of the disturbances of mowing or burning. There's a gas line that runs through that one, so that burning is not an option. So it would be back to mowing and controlling the invasive, the bush honeysuckle, and removing, the cottonwood trees and whatever may be. But it could definitely be done. But 4 years of doing nothing, it will take a little bit, but it definitely can be done. There's still lots of good natives present. And then the seed bank would be tremendous also if they would go back and attempt to reclaim it.
And then Claire, one final one, because I think this popped up a few times. Do you know of any financial comparisons like the one Dan did, but using multiple different neighborhoods?
It's been a little bit since I've looked, because that would be really helpful. And we've looked at kind of collecting some of that data, but it's kind of hard to get, complicated sometimes. So no, not offhand, but hopefully that's something that could be pulled together if people were willing to share information, because that financial aspect is really powerful.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we are past our time. And so I do like to try to stick to our time. But I want to thank everyone for tuning in. Like I said, if you did go on this webinar, you should be getting information from me, as well a link, as well as all the PDFs. If you're watching this later, if you follow that QR code, it should take you to all the same resources. So everyone have a good night. Thanks.